Good morning, everyone. Today we are with Professor Ashok Sahani from Punjab University. So let's start by introducing him. Professor Ashok Sahani is a world renowned paleontologist with his specialization being structural and functional adaptations in mammalian dental enamel through time, vertebrate paleontology in the context of paleobiogeography, and geodynamic models of plate tectonics. He has around 200 publications and with more than 25 doctoral students, he is an asset to Indian science community. He has discovered India's own T-Rex, which is Rajasaurus narmadensis, which was discovered on the banks of Narmada River around 20 years ago along with his team. Professor Sahani was elected as a fellow member of Indian Academy of Sciences, Bengaluru. He was awarded the National Geoscience Award for Excellence in 2011 by the Government of India. He was also nominated as an honorary life member by Society of Vertebral Paleontology in USA. He continues his work as an INSA senior scientist, where he is closely involved in popularizing science and setting up museums and natural history parks across India. Thank you, sir, for agreeing to do this.
No, it's my pleasure.
So let's start with an interesting topic. So there's words articles on that there should be resurrection of dinosaurs for
Resurrection.
extinct. So what's your take on that?
No, that's a far-fetched fantasy. There's no need to resurrect anything, because on Earth, evolution takes its own course. So humans are meddling with everything. They're meddling with the atmosphere. They're meddling with the oceans. I think this is one field that we need not meddle with. Of course, there are many scientific attempts, and they should be encouraged. For instance, in the Siberian elephants, to get their DNA and try to resurrect something that is easily available, that is doable. But I think dinosaurs, the DNA is not very easily available, and there will be doubts that the DNA is true dinosaur DNA. So even though Michael Crichton made his novel, and everyone has watched many versions of Jurassic Park, but the truth is that it's very difficult to extract dinosaur DNA, because in all probability it's contaminated if it's at all there. So that's, I think, not possible.
Thank you, sir, for that view. Sir, let's know about your childhood, sir. How were you as a child? What were your hobbies?
So I came from a family of scientists. My grandfather, believe it or not, worked with Ernest Rutherford in 1914 in Manchester. And my uncle was a fellow of the Royal Society, Birbal Sani. And my father was also a geologist. So my childhood was not normal in that sense. It was steeped in all kinds of discussions all the time. So my mother didn't want me to become a paleontologist, because there were a lot of rocks and fossils lying around, and she thought they were cluttering up her home. So, but it so happened that I did become a paleontologist. So that's the truth of it.
So do you have any precious collections from your childhood days where you, I don't know, collected a fossil and kept it even till now?
Yes, I have. I have. In fact, people can be divided into inveterate collectors. They collect everything, right from stamps to fossils to whatever they find. So I'm afraid I'm one of those. I collect everything. I just don't let go. So I still have my coin collection from 1952. So I'm just saying that, and other people don't bother, but some people bother a lot. So I happen to belong to that category.
Sir, so what is your favorite fossil out of your collection? Which one you like the most?
Actually, it's very difficult to pinpoint. I would say that there were three major findings, that I've been associated with, not only dinosaurs. So I think the one of the favorite fossils would be that of a primitive whale, or insect in amber. So the it just depends. Of course, coming to dinosaurs, it was not T Rex that actually, T Rex was a team finding. There was nothing personal in that. But we did find eggs of dinosaurs, nests of dinosaurs. And these three would be the most memorable experiences in my very long career. It's about, I started research in 1963. So you can calculate how many years I've been, I'm 80 years old. So you can calculate how many years I've been in the field. So I would say these three things stand out, at least for me. It's always personal.
So, since you mentioned about eggs, and also in Gujarat, in the fossil park, there are many eggs lying there, but there are many cases of eggs being stolen, or like people selling illegally the various dinosaur eggs. So, what is your take on that? Why something is not being done properly to safeguard?
Actually, a lot is being done, but this is a big country and there's so many sentiments involved. The people, of course, there's pure vandalism that cannot be forgiven or forgotten and it has to be punished. But you must understand that in Ravali, or the park that you are talking about, the eggs can occur in limestones, freshwater limestones. And people have been building their huts with those limestones for hundreds of years. You understand? So now you suddenly say, we're going to demolish your hut because I can see a eggshell in that. So it's not a very easy topic. Pure vandalism, pure theft has to be condemned. But there are many other factors. One very big factor is education. If the local people must know the value. Then how do you tell villagers who are struggling for their very existence the value of a dinosaur egg? How do you do it? The people who have not gone to school, the people who don't know what a dinosaur is. It's a complex problem, and I think we are working on a law of trying to conserve our heritage. It's our duty, our responsibility. We're working on that. But as I said, sometimes the law is so strict that genuine scientists are prevented from going to the field. How do you determine who's a genuine scientist? Isn't it? So it's a complex issue, but we are working on it.
Thank you, sir. And again, thinking about talking about that education, many people don't say why do we need history, or like why do we need evolution itself from the very back past. Maybe even the brachiopods, all the fossils that we find. They don't. People are more focused on the future. They say why do we need the past? So like from your words, sir, why do we need the past?
Well, the number one point, they wouldn't be here if they didn't have a past. Okay, so anybody who says that, you tell them that. And in order to understand who you are today or what you will become tomorrow, you have to know your roots. So whether it is history or geological history or paleontology, everything goes in telling you who you are. I'm not only talking about humans. Humans are only one element in this whole diverse earth, and we will not survive unless the others survive. So the question is, it's important to know that in the geological past, what factors led to extinctions? Why did biodiversity suddenly fall in the past? Only when you understand that will you understand what is going to happen in the future. Let me give you an example. I don't know. I don't know when it was exactly, beginning of this millennium, that there was a tsunami. Okay, a tsunami that caused havoc right from Indonesia to India. Before that, no one had heard of tsunami. They had to tell every student the spelling of tsunami. Whereas tsunamis were very common in geological time. It was very common. So I'm just saying that you do not know what negative factors may happen in the future unless you know the past. Therefore, it's important to know the past in order to know what we can expect in the future. And the tsunami is one factor that before 2004 or whenever it was, we didn't know that there was this kind of calamity. After that, we got activated. So there are many such. In around 250 million years ago, the oxygen in the world suddenly depleted, and the earth lost 96% of all its life. Can you imagine that? We are actually survivors of the 4%. So the what factors cause depletion of oxygen? What can happen in the past can happen in the. So I think those who ask these questions, you can tell them this. Okay? Go
Yes,
ahead.
sir. Thank you, sir. You told your dad was also a geologist, but did you, as growing up, have any amount of like self doubt, like why am I going to this field? Because we all students also have that when we are studying.
No, no, self-doubt is a very good thing. If you have no self-doubt, you're not going to go anywhere. So the question always is there. It's a question of your reliance on yourself. Everyone should ask, am I doing the right thing? And everyone should be worried about it. So I don't see any problem in that. I was like everyone else is worried. Will I do my PhD? Will I flunk my PhD? Will I get a job after my PhD? Where will I get a job? Will I be happy? Will I be satisfied in the work that I do? These are normal questions. So it's not, I don't think one has to worry about not worrying. One should worry. It's not a problem.
Sir, for the audience, can you tell us about your work in very simple terms, not just in scientific terms, just very simple words?
So I was 22 years old when I went to the States. I got admission at a university in the state of Minnesota, which is very cold. The temperature goes down to minus 30 and stays like that for at least 5 or 6 weeks. 30. If it even warms up, it goes to minus 15 or minus 5. So it was a big change coming from Lucknow, where I was studying. So there was the temperature, then there was the culture. It's different, so anyway, I got a topic that I really liked, and that was in those days in the 60s. They had just found these dinosaurs and mammals in Montana. So I was given a PhD topic in Montana, which is far away from in absolutely in badland country. There's nothing there except for rattlesnakes and the big Missouri River and a lot of rocks. So you can imagine at that age to be given the full responsibility. You're talking about self doubts. The first self doubt is, am I going to find anything? Is if I find something, is it going to be worthwhile? So these are normal thoughts, and you need a lot of luck. You need a lot of luck to get by. So I had my share, I guess.
Sir, speaking about your work, like we all have this monotonous pace where even though when we love a profession, there are just monotonous moments where we're like, oh, what am I even doing? I just want to give this up. Was there any moments like that?
No, I'm afraid there were no such moments. uh, I just enjoyed doing whatever I was doing. It just depends, on your attitude to your work. You find everything interesting. So I found still at this age, I find everything of great interest. There's nothing I can do about it.
Sir, about the dinosaur, Rajasaurus narmadensis, why was it named Rajasaurus? I mean, I'm just curious when I read about
Yeah,
that.
well, I was instrumental in the name, but I must tell you that I was only a member of a team. The one of my very former students who had started his PhD with me and joined the Geological Survey of India, Suresh Srivastav. He's the one who was given the official task of excavating the Balasinor dinosaur locality, and it was he actually who excavated all the dinosaurs in 1982, 83, or thereabouts. And they were lying actually from after the collection. They were lying in the offices of the Geological Survey of India. So it was only in 2003, many years after they were found, that they were identified. And coming to your question, see, in America and in other places in the northern hemisphere, you have T. rex. You know what it means? It means Tyrannosaurus rex. Rex is king. So I took Rex and called it Rajasaurus because Rex means king, and Narbadensis because it was very close to the Narbada river. So that's how the name came about.
Speaking of like nomenclature, sir, I have heard that geologists have very difficult time naming rocks. I mean, why is that? Then biologists or like cosmologists who name planets or like organisms, some are even difficult to pronounce. When we were younger, I couldn't spell conglomerate. It took so much time to know that word itself. Why is it so hard, sir?
No. So you're talking about naming species. So actually, there are rules. There's an international code of zoological nomenclature. So when you're naming something, you have to be very correct about how you name the genus if it's new and name the species. So there's strict rules. So unless you know what the rules are, and then there's always this little bit that you want to add something of your own, so I don't think it's difficult, but you have to follow the rules. And for us, there's no big name. Maybe for people who are not in the field, they find that their names are peculiar. In fact, conglomerate, just to come back to what you say, is the English word conglomeration, meaning collection. So it's not really out of the way.
Yeah, it took some while to understand what did conglomerate mean when only in high school. Oh, so that is why they named it like that. It took some time.
Yes, exactly.
And sir, do you have any like concerns or any concerns about the academy in India where we are at
Academy.
present? Academics.
Yeah, I'm always concerned. I think a teacher should always be concerned. If a teacher's not concerned, then there's something wanting. I basically I've been concerned for many years about a subject which nobody listens to me, and the topic that I'm actually concerned about is the dichotomy into engineering and medical streams. I think this is absurd. In India, I don't know, in North India at least, he's a mathematics stream, he is a biology stream. I think this is the most absurd dichotomy that there can be in academics. But nobody seems to listen to me, So I've tried my best because everything is connected. If you are going to have a dichotomy, then the twain will never meet. They may meet at a stage when you're 30 years old, when you're forced to see the connections. So I did the biology stream, but when I went and saw that there was so much that I could do, if I knew a little mathematics, I knew no mathematics. So it occurred to me something like 15-20 years after my intermediate or whatever it's called, that this is wrong. This is absolutely incorrect, and there should be no dichotomy in education. It's all one. So that's my primary concern. Of course, there are many other concerns, but this is a basic concern, and it's not being rectified.
Like, is there any solution that we can implement, any alternate structure of the
Yeah, yeah.
academia?
Our system is very inflexible. So the problem is you have to introduce flexibility from a very early stage. Even the engineering guy only in the IT does humanities, and that also many students who do IT students who do humanities, they think it's a waste of time. It's not like that in the other parts of the world. You can do music and you can do geology. Our focus on academics, I feel, is so rigid that we cannot see the overall picture. The overall picture includes everything. You can't do everything, but if you're fond of philosophy and you still want to become a scientist, you should have the option of doing that. You don't have it now. So this rigidity goes right down, as I said, to this initial dichotomy. Very, very rigid. You have to get rid of that somehow.
So, do you think this new education policy that is being introduced and they have planned to complete it by 2035 is going to help in this way?
Yeah, it's going to help, but it has to get rid of the rigidity. Everyone cannot be an Einstein.
Right.
And it's only the Einsteins that make a mark. The rest of us, we are just updating the data, isn't it? So, in order to get people or pick geniuses or people who can really make a mark, most of them, you look at the world today, many of the people who made a mark didn't go through formal education. They left because they didn't think the education was good enough. Okay, so and they are the people who made the mark. So I think that we should have a eye open for people who do things differently. Even if they fail in all other subjects. If there's a mathematician who doesn't know English, so what? His language is mathematics. And we don't have a system like that. He will probably, they'll say that in English he got some very low percentage and therefore he cannot get admission in some department or whatever it is. We have that kind of system. So that's unfortunate.
Sir, and speaking about that, like, what are like the interdisciplinary fields of geology that a student can think about in if he or she comes in geology?
The sky is the limit because geology is not a subject per se. It's an interactive discipline. It interacts with all other disciplines. So you can be a mathematics and still do geology, a physicist and still do geology, chemistry. So there are many fields. There's practically no field that I know. You give me a field and I'll tell you how it's related to geology. So geology is basically interaction, and it's a basic interaction because it concerns the earth. To me, I am absolutely amazed at the fact that in high school they don't teach geology per se. We live on the earth, we feed on the earth, we destroy the earth, and whenever, and I've tried this also with a number of colleagues, to introduce the subject, like you have physics and chemistry, but you don't have earth sciences because the usual reasoning is, but we teach them, the syllabus has volcanoes, the syllabus has this, has weathering. That's not the point. The question is that unless it has an identity, unless the subject, any subject, has an identity, the student doesn't know what to do. For him, there's only chemistry, physics, biology, mathematics. So that's a big problem as far as I think.
And there aren't many institutes which offer geology. Like they offer, but then, yeah, but compared to the other science fields, there aren't many. We need to search actually when we take up MSc or BSc in geology.
Yeah, no, that's true because, as I said, this is the problem. Usually, students come to geology by default. They don't like chemistry, they're not good at mathematics, they don't like big names in biology, so let's try geology. That's not the reason to take up a subject, but that's what happens many times. That's because there's no identity at the high school level.
That's what high school or even middle school level children, how do we convey the importance of geology and at least to teach them the basics of geology? How do we simplify geology in terms for them?
The geology is everywhere. If you live on a farm and they're drilling for water, in one place you'll find water, 300 meters you won't find water. That's geology, isn't it? If people don't understand that, how do you make them understand? If the river floods where you live, that's geology. Why does it flood? Why is it cutting? Why are you building there? Firstly, the fact is, if you look at the Himalayas, there's a lot of building going on when the builder even knows that the slope is unstable, or even they're making roads that are bound to fail because there's no regard for geology. So geology is everywhere, So you don't have to look for it, but you have to point it out. You have to point it out that if there's no water in a well 300 meters away, how does water collect? I've asked this question. I've asked this question to beginning students that you can see the moon, which is far away. But tell me what lies 100 meters beneath your feet. You try and ask that question, and you'll find all kinds of answers. Nobody knows They won't be able to tell you what lies beneath the feet 100 or 200 meters. Forget 1 kilometer. Or if there's if the building is made on soil, where did the soil come from? Just basic questions. But they'll tell you, about Mars, and they'll tell you about Jupiter, and they will tell you all kinds of statistics about the solar system. How far, what is, they'll give you complicated answers about radiation, solar radiation. You ask them a basic question, they won't be able to tell you. So that's the gap, and that's the gap that you have to bridge.
Sir, like astronomy, cosmology, and all, they were basically brought into main field because some maybe educators or some big names were popularizing it. Is there like any way we can do the same for geology? Because people seem to forget that like the basics of science, one of the basic fields is geology.
We can only try actually, because I've been trying, but I haven't succeeded. So had the good fortune of teaching the introductory geology course way back in 1968, and I love teaching the introductory course. For this reason only, just to show that this is as basic as you can get. You can't get more basic science than this. But the problem is people don't see it as a science. They don't see, the scientific aspects. That's the problem.
When you were talking about that Himalayan road, it reminded me about where I live in Bangalore. So PG of mine's recently it got flooded and it has flooded the entire town. The water sunk in and it has flooded the entire town. Apparently, even though geologists told don't do that, don't at least bury it, they didn't listen. They built an entire town on it and it's become a loss that it has been destroyed here.
No, but they do it everywhere. Money talks, geology doesn't. So if real estate is money, and people say, that whatever is going to happen will happen, but that's not true. So right now, they are blaming climate change for the fact that sea level will rise. The sea level has always risen and fallen, isn't it? If you are building your cities on the beach, on some shore, obviously they're going to fall to this, either they're going to be sunk or they're going to be high and dry. Both ways is wrong. Everybody wants everything to be absolutely status quo. Nothing changes. Nature is not like that. Everything changes. Everything is changing. And everything will change. So unless you understand that, why blame climate change? Blame yourself.
If students, I mean, get into geology, what are like the common challenges? I mean, we all have, every subject has its own set of challenges that they have to go through, but like that, are there any specifics in geology that they have to face?
So the main problem, I think, is in India and in countries like India, where employability is prime. There's the first consideration is, will I get a job? That determines what you do. Okay, so there are very few people who will take a subject because they love it, and they will, even if they don't get a good job, they will still pursue. But most of us obviously look for a job at the end of our degrees. So that's the biggest problem, actually, employability. So there are many places that actually employ geologists, as you may know. But most of our universities, most of the departments are only 50% strength. No one is recruiting. There's a great dearth of recruitment. If everyone was recruiting, then there would be no problem. But you have these cycles of recruitment and then cycles of quiescence. Nothing happens. So a student who studies during these periods when nothing is happening, he gets frustrated. So that's the problem. Everything has to pull at an equal pace.
Sir, speaking of jobs, like, are there any common jobs where geologists are hired so that can give an insight to students?
Yeah, the Geological Survey hires, the ONGC hires, the Atomic Energy also hires. So there are a number of people that hire. But there's no private enterprise. There was, like the mines and all, there's so many restrictions that there are not enough private players opening mines. Just getting a lease is a problem. So in many other countries, many geologists, young geologists get jobs in private enterprises, whether it's oil or whether it's here. There's a lot of state-owned stuff. So if there's state-owned stuff, and they have to then recruit, so that's a problem. And the colleges don't teach. There are very few colleges that recruit or that teach geology. There are some, but very few. So if everyone were to push to the maximum level, you will get a job opportunity.
Sir, and specifically for like paleontologists, if we come from the paleontology perspective, most of the paleontologists before were hired for fossil fuel companies, but these days because of climate change that they are being shut down. So what are like the other jobs that a paleontologist do?
So in the US, this was a problem long time ago. So I'm talking about vertebrate paleontology. Vertebrate paleontology is the paleontology of vertebrate. So many people like me who did vertebrate paleontology, my colleagues, my friends, they got jobs and they're still getting jobs in medical colleges where they teach anatomy. So there's nothing like this in India. If you look at the medical colleges in India, they are anatomy is essential. If you don't know anatomy, you're not going to be a doctor. So in the States, it's the vertebrate paleontologist because he has an idea. He or she has an idea not only of the human anatomy, but again of the anatomy of all other vertebrates. So again, this is a mindset that I'm only going to do human anatomy. How am I concerned about the anatomy of a crocodile? How is it going to help me? So we are always focused, very narrowly focused on outcome. We want, if we put in so much energy, we want to see the outcome. But actually basic sciences is not like that. In basic sciences, you need a lot of inputs to come up with something like Darwin did. You won't get a Darwin with our system of education. You need education that is very broad based, and this is something that people don't understand. I don't know why. You have to broad base your education. You can't narrow it.
Sir, I just had a thought like when you were talking about vertebrate paleontology, like the coral reefs are dying, which is very, very bad for the entire ocean system. Can geologists do something about that? Even in India, also, it's happening a lot.
So there are multiple reasons for coral reefs. One, of course, is the ocean pollution, and coral reefs are very sensitive to sea level. So if sea level goes up or down, they keep pace. But if the level goes, the rate at which sea level is going up or down is more than they can cope with, they will die. So there's pollution in the sea, there's warming, there's sea level fluctuations. So since corals are very, very sensitive to all these, and they've been sensitive not only now, there have been times in Earth history when there were a lot of reefs, and then there were times that through acidification of the ocean or whatever reason, the reefs died out. These are cyclical things. But the thing is that you have to analyze why it's happening. Maybe you can't stop the Earth from rotating, but at least you should know why it's rotating. That's the level at which you can think.
Sir, and like about the Himalayas, it is the youngest mountain range in the world. About that, like, how are they so strong? I don't know what the right word to use. Like, what are the ores or what are the compositions of Himalayan mountains?
So this is a basic question in geology. The mountains are nothing else but ancient oceans that have been uplifted. So on top of Everest, you have fossils, Devonian fossils from an ancient sea. You understand? So if they appear strong or they appear to you to be growing, it's because India is still dashing into Asia. It's not stopped. It's doing that 1 centimeter every year. Doesn't sound a lot. But 1 centimeter every year is quite a lot, isn't it? So in 100,000 years, it's quite a good number. So that's why when you say strong, I think you mean why there's so many things happening there. In the Aravalis or the Nilgiris, whatever had to happen has happened. Everything is quiet and peaceful. But the Himalayas are still in turbulence. The more you raise them, the more they erode. The more they erode, the more flood they come. So it's all turbulent, and that's the reason is that India is still crashing into Asia.
Sir, and when I was reading about the dinosaur nesting sites, why was India, this entire subcontinent chosen by like the dinosaurs as a nesting site? Was it that much favorable?
No. Let me just tell you that if you have dinosaurs in Antarctica, and there are dinosaurs in Antarctica, or America, or South America, or China, obviously they were nesting somewhere. You can't have dinosaurs without having eggs, isn't it? The question is of preservation. They're preserved in India. So your question has to be reframed that why are they preserved? And that is the question that is important, not why are they here? They are everywhere. If you can't have a population without eggs. So that's and they're in India. They actually one of the reasons why you have these are that many of the sites after nesting they were actually covered by basalts. So they have not been eroded. In many other places, it's very difficult to erode basalts. They're protected. So many of these egg sites in India are preserved because of this. Otherwise, 65 million years of erosion, many would have got weathered out. But they're preserved because of that. One of the reasons.
And sir, about preservation, so what is the progress on creating a national repository for kind of preserving for already excavated fossils, and is there any plan for establishing a museum of natural history in India?
So about 2 3 years ago, there was a big movement, and it's still going on. This was the Indian Museum of Earth. So this was actually one of the main issues, and I'm happy to say that there's movement on that. And the question that you raise about repository is part of this movement because the question is for paleontology or for all other subjects, you need a permanent place where your fossils can be kept. Right now, you can't keep them, there's no provision. There's no provision for keeping them in small state universities. There's no funding. So it's difficult to get even a room. Forget repository. So there's movement on that, and I'm hopeful. And hopefully, I think people realize, everyone realizes that this is an important issue, and this is one of the subjects on which there's movement. So let's hope.
Sir, who are the key people who are leading this movement?
So there are many people. There was a right from the top, the principal scientific advisor to the government. Right from that level to all the geologists, there are many sub movements. There are movements of people who are conserving geoheritage. People like me who are more on an individual trying to do it. So there are a lot of people in Bangalore, in the Indian Institute of Science, who are concerned. Everyone's concerned. Everyone's trying to do something. So I think something will be done. The question is, when a lot of people are concerned, you have to collect, and then there's so many different factors involved. Some that conflict with each other. By the time you solve them out, it takes time. But we are on our way.
So last but not the least, like, do you have any words of encouragement for people who are really interested in geology and just want to pursue that?
Well, the reason at this age I'm giving the interview is because I want to encourage them, isn't it? In fact, at my own level, I set up a museum, the government museum in Chandigarh has all my fossils. So at my own level, I've tried my best to encourage, built all kinds of models at the Science City in near Jalandhar, so that people get to see. Our problem is that our young people are so obsessed with dinosaurs. There are many other fossils. Life is not only dinosaurs. And in many places in the world, young children, boys and girls, 8 or 9, around their home, they find fossils and they get interested. It's like stamp collection in the beginning. then they start asking questions. What is this? What is that? So that's one way. The other way is going to museums. So in my own way, I've tried to rectify that. But hopefully, when this museum, which is called Time, the Indian Museum of Earth, then more people, more young students. Basically, if you don't ask questions, in fact, one of our problems is that we are so disciplined in school that we are not allowed to ask questions, and that is, I think, one of the biggest, saddest things that can happen. Our model of a good student is a disciplined student. An unruly student who asks questions, he's not regarded at all, and that is the problem. We don't encourage. So I'd like to end with this, that you have to encourage questions. There's no school system that will produce people who are curious unless you answer their question. So that I think is an important issue.
Yeah, sir. Thank you so much for this interview, sir. We are really grateful to have like such a big person talking about.
No big person here. It's just a ordinary person. No big person.
Sir, we all aspire to be like so passionate and scientists like you, sir. Are we the young generation, our generation? So
No, it's a lot of luck, a little hard work, a lot of support from students. So that's it.
Hope you loved the episode. Subscribe to our show and see you next Saturday.